Initiative Task Force, which is an ad hoc subcommittee of the Princeton Planning Board. Present for this evening's meeting are task force members Mayor Liz Lempert, who is also a member of the Planning Board, Councilwoman Jenny Krummuller, who is a member of the Planning Board, Gail Ullman, Vice Chairman of the Planning Board and Chair of the Master Plan Committee, and Tim Quinn, who is a Planning Board member and Chair of the Zoning Amendment Review Committee, which is called ZARC. Also present from the RBA group are Mark Keener, who is Director of Urban Planning, and Neil Desai, who is a Senior City Planner from that group. Also present is our planner, Lee Solo, and I think we can expect to see a few members of the Princeton Council as well. In April of this year, the Princeton Council undertook to address the problem of teardowns and out-of-character new residential construction within many Princeton neighborhoods. They retained the consulting firm RBA Group to guide the municipality and the newly appointed task force by evaluating the existing character of various neighborhoods and analyzing the effects of recent demolitions and the change that may have been permitted by existing zoning. The charge to the task force and consultants has been to attract citizen input at all stages of the documentation process, which is now well underway. Comparative data and solutions from other municipalities have been used to place Princeton's problems in a broader context. In the end, after evaluating the information gathered, the task force and consultants will begin to introduce policies, guidelines, and regulations that will shape future residential development. Ultimately, this will result in new houses and their landscape settings that better complement our neighborhoods, as well as a new and renewed appreciation of existing homes in their context. Let me turn the meeting over now to Mark Keener, who will outline the evening's program and the opportunities for audience participation. And I should remind you that there is a sign-up sheet for attendance that is circulating. That's so that we can alert those of you who wish to come back again and again to that there will be future meetings of this group. I think I should also mention that we're aiming to sort of wrap things up by 10 o'clock, and if we're in the middle of a hot and interesting discussion, we will probably carry that to the next meeting. So, Mark, if you start, please.
Terrific. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Again, my name is Mark Keener. I've been a professional planner for 20 years, also a former home builder and recovering architect. I think what you're up to here is a complicated endeavor, and we've been doing quite a bit of research to sort of place into context. And the main purpose of this evening is, one, to share that with you, and then give each of you an opportunity to provide observations or share concerns. So there'll be, let's see. We have an agenda. We're going to start with starting points, but you can see from agenda, we're going to sort of unpack this in small boxes, and we're going to pause for discussion breaks, here and there. So, on some level, it's important to create a kind of a shared understanding of what really is going on and what fundamental facts are surrounding it, and then also to establish a sort of a check the connection between what you have happening and what the underlying trends are and your de facto kind of long-range plan, which is meant to be embedded in your zoning. So a couple things: the borough and township have merged, but your zoning code haven't quite come together. So this one thing is an opportunity to kind of shine a light on some of those things that need to be kind of attended to. It's also important that we all sort of agree that what we're really looking at here is not because we're concerned about the demise of a couple of hundred of middle-aged houses. There are sort of big picture issues here, and we need to sort of back up a little bit and think about what's really going on. And just to put a kind of a time frame on it, things change. Things have changed a lot. You look at this map up here, and you can see that that there's a lot of ground that once was farmland and now is occupied by, lawns and lanes and houses. 1917, a nice kind of snapshot. You can see the sort of little bumps in the middle. That's all the buildings in town. The sort of underlying framework, a couple of things. There is topography from Rocky Hill, Mount Rose to the waterways. That's 350 feet. So that creates a kind of framework that building construction and private investment is nested within. Also there's the transportation overlay, Route 1, the train. Nassau was Route 27, which was the Lincoln Highway, first transcontinental highway. It's all part of a sort of a bigger picture that was meant to invite private investment. 1931, you can see that it sort of set the stage. There's a lot of farmland there. The little patches tells you, that was a farm. And when we jump to 2002, you can see that the planning profession has provided over the orderly conversion of farmland into subdivision and suburb. That's where we are. 1952, some of the sort of older neighborhoods. This is up Harrison. There's the crossing of Harrison and Hamilton. See where the school is going to happen, and the little Princeton shopping center. So 1952, the first families are moving in to kind of smaller homes that are still serviceable. But think about that's 60 years ago. A lot has changed in the universe. And as these houses, aged into generations and different families moved in, they've made conversions and expansions to accommodate needs. That's really kind of sets the stage, and it's important to know that there are kind of implications for that trend. This is something from one of the newspapers, just pointing out that 1973, 2014, houses were smaller with more people in them a long time ago, and now the houses are bigger with fewer people in them. And you can sort of anticipate that there will be sort of impacts associated with that. It takes up more ground. There's opportunity for different sort of impacts, but not necessarily related to traffic, but also there's a value shift, and we're going to sort of walk through sort of all those things. At the same time, nationally, a lot of communities have come to a place where they're concerned that they're not getting the kind of private investment, and the kind of buildings that are being built are not what was sort of anticipated in their plan or their code. Buildings that are out of character, garage-fronted houses that look peculiar on certain streets, too much paved lawn, mature tree canopy going away, and houses that are much larger than their neighboring houses. Here's a little snapshot of one of those sort of codes, and this is meant to be a guideline. It sort of runs through sort of an array of different kinds of issues that weren't handled in their zoning code so well, and then here is a kind of the provision reference to where in the new code you can sort of see how those things are adapted. So the navigation of the code is kind of important too, and it's something else that's been identified here as being a bit problematic. This is Norfolk, Virginia, where a talented group of architects were invited to provide detailed pattern books that was both hand-on-the-shoulder advice, but really carefully laid out design advice. Not adopted, not a law, but very, very useful, and they were also, and other communities have done this too, they've been calibrated to different neighborhoods, so it's not just global. It's recognizing that there's an authentic character to each of the neighborhoods, and that here's how we document it and then transfer it as buildings evolve. Somerville, Massachusetts, they looked at their same thing, sort of. They looked at their zoning code and realized that the zoning code was hard to navigate, meaning was vague, so the direction wasn't very clear. As a result of that, outcomes were sometimes contradictory to the intended meaning in the code. Alexandria, Virginia, also a kind of mature, built-out community. We're seeing a lot of reinvestment in private property and houses that were seemed to be sort of puzzling on a lot of different levels, and they wanted to spend the time to kind of diagnose where they were, what was going wrong, and what those trends meant, but still be able to invite and be hospitable to private investment and transformation. So here's a couple of images from their PowerPoint where they sort of point out that, here's a handsome brick building, but the new building is way out of scale from its neighbors. And same thing here. You might think that, well, that's very appropriate architecture. Let's think through what it means when you're building a building 3 times the size of the sum. Sometimes it's welcome. Sometimes that's kind of normal succession. Sometimes it might mean something else. So that's what we're here to kind of set up, that discussion. Below, also from the Alexandria investigation, a building that one might think is handsome architecturally, but there are certain things about it that are very much out of character, sometimes welcome. But we want to be able to sort of understand the dimension of that change. Here, I think one of the things that we've been talking about is that neighbors have observed here in Princeton, houses are being torn down and replaced by new houses that appear to be uncharacteristically large for the block, eliminate tree canopy, seem to have more paved over surfaces than is necessary, and maybe public policy should provide better guidance on that, and diminish the character of the street by dominant garage and auto entry in streets where that's just not common. Just start with a thesis. Here, see if this sounds right to you. Although character, scale, and era do vary, individual Princeton neighborhood streets and houses exemplify building traditions that should be respected and landscape conventions that should be disregarded only rarely. Too bombastic? I think it sort of lays out a kind of clear notion that the public realm is a street and each individual building has some responsibility that it sort of all add up. We'll talk more about that. But I would say that if you sort of thought about that as an underlying principle that you'd somehow support to some extent by public policy, that some of the things that have been happening here are not always constructive to fulfilling the intention of a policy like that. So some of these things would be tweaked in some way, not necessarily substantially, but in meaningful ways so that they sort of contribute more clearly to the nature of the street. So given that, say we would agree that it's time to walk over to the zoning and put the hood up and make some adjustments. What kinds of things would you do to sort of have an influence on development and investment environment? One would be to do like Norfolk did and lots of other communities, hand-on-the-shoulder design guidelines that can be very kind of detailed and prescriptive. You don't have to do it, but let me tell you what this neighborhood is made of. Something more about the DNA that you might not know. Or you could take it a next step, like Somerville did. Clarify or repair regulations. Where viable, propose near-term standalone remedies that you can adopt to the zoning code and amend the zoning code in the form of ordinances that can be done soon and address near-term problems that we all understand. Take a next step, which is to incorporate regulation into a comprehensive borough township zoning update. Make it more sort of vivid. Develop the narrative so that it defends a broader public policy and then be very much more clear about how the code is constructed, how it's meant to be applied, and how it's navigated. Or you could say, we need to redirect or abandon some of these ideas because they overreach legal limits, are wrong, or just not viable. Sometimes you come up with ideas that are just not good ideas. So here's a framework. I'm going to sort of walk through this a little bit. First, just identify neighborhoods and streets where there's an intense degree of activity. If you look at the number, I'm about to tell you about this, the number of teardowns and replacements, it equals a substantial amount of the overall single-family residential development here. Because, as we said before, it's a built-out place, so that's inevitable. Document street types, building traditions, those things that I talked about. What is the underlying DNA of these places? Look at zoning and see where there's a kind of a disconnect between what zoning says, what the nature of this place is, and what public policy is. Understand and gauge economic impacts, both from private profit perspective, private gain perspective, and municipal revenue, because that definitely has a role here in this discussion. Understand the environmental dimension, and outline a framework that most, all, some agree with to sort of move forward and frame public purpose, policy, and therefore zoning. Understand the case law and like that. So data points. We wanted to know how significant, that means how much, where, what kind of underlying trends are related to this, what is a trend in specific areas, what are the typical prevailing characteristics, and to sort of calibrate that by zoning district. Where is the zoning, as I said a moment ago, where is it not aligned with what's there or what you'd like to see there? What is the economic dimension? So we're going to sort of run through those facts. So here's a trend line. What it tells you, there was 217 demolition permits, and it sort of lays it out by year. The 35 in 2013 needs to be reconciled to the fact that some of those were for the Alexander Road, Princeton, replacement, and so those are those sort of house-looking buildings that have become something else. So that's what the trend line looks like. Looking at since July 2016, think about it. I mean, it's not clear that there's a trend. It's just clearly that something is happening. So it's 217 houses in 11 and a half years. That's 18.9 houses a year with a pace of 25 per year in the last 5. Neil is going to say something. No? Oh, okay. I thought you grabbed it, Mike. Hold on for that. It'll happen soon. So when you look at the geography, it took some time to put all this together by going through the demolition permits and mapping them by address. But what that tells you is that in the activities concentrated in the central and eastern areas, there's another sort of over here near the Hunt School and Russell Ave, there's another sort of cluster. Different scenario there. Along this Random Road, there's also another cluster. So let's look at that and start to understand, what that might mean. This is just saying by year. So you get to see where there are kind of hot spots by year with a high degree of activity. Another thing that the Norfolk sort of guidelines did is it was very careful about offering good advice about how to expand a home that exists. And they went across all the sort of normative building types and said 1-story, 2-story, garage addition, over different kinds of normal things that would happen, and it provided good advice on how that might happen. This maps building additions, sizable building additions. Okay.
I know, we're flipping through these slides, these quantity slides pretty quickly, but they are available on the website, princetonneighborhoods.org, in case you want to look at them more closely.
Yes, sir.
It's Princeton Neighborhoods with S at the end, so princetonneighborhoods.org.
Also, you'll find right at that same location links to a lot of really terrific examples of what others that have been engaged in this kind of investigation, what they have done. So it's useful to know that others have tread this path before. Some have done a lot of analysis and not done anything, which is fine, and some have come across with different kinds of prescriptions depending on what the issues were. So it's good to see that. It's good to spend some time on that site. It's really key to us to sort of look at that within the context of underlying zoning and start to pick up, patterns. And since the zoning is sort of calibrated to lot size and street dimension, you can expect that you'll be able to tease out certain kinds of information. I think, like one thing, for instance, if you look at borough and township zoning for residences, sort of arrayed across this map with numbers that are too small to read, you get to see certain families of topics and issues. For instance, the kind of smaller lot singles like R4, like Witherspoon, John Street neighborhood, there you have 8-acre parcels, and the issues and topics that you'll be focused on there are different than the larger lot, 2 to 3 acre, where really the street kind of sets up the architecture and identity of the place and the landscape. Very different than the cottage street, where you've got streets and porches right next to sidewalk. It's a very different environment, and the kinds of issues and things that you want to take up and think about are different. Which is, if you look at the sort of the land in the middle, which is the 1/2 to 1/4 acre lots, There's a whole array of other kinds of issues, and that's where you start to look at the places where garage front buildings are not compatible with the nature of the street. Because at a quarter acre, the buildings become very important to how the place is created. Different than a 2-acre lot where you've got a series of individual pavilions where it's kind of terrific where everyone is exaggeratingly different than the other. They're all individuals. When you have a small lot row, it's very much the building that creates the nature of the street. So looking at that, I think that the more complicated topics really do kind of collect around the mid-level there, and I think that's where you'll want to spend some more time thinking. So that's the first charge. First, identify neighborhoods and streets where the redevelopment infill activity is concentrated. Look at street types and zoning and begin to unpack a story there. So I'm going to... Okay, sorry. So we're just about to take a discussion break, but I wanted to sort of just show you how we're thinking about doing this. First, it's like to go down, take a sample of those places, those zoning districts where there's the highest degree of activity. A quadrat is what they call it in science. Neil calls it a swatch. But you're just taking, or a core sample is what engineers call it. But you understand a good deal about the representative sample, and then the idea is to sort of document it. So I think I'm going to talk about a few of these, and this is the kind of framework for doing that. So first, there's the 1,000 by 1,000 foot core sample, and then arrayed are all the sort of underlying characteristics, first by zoning, and then by what we're seeing. And the kind of coarse level of zoning, which is basically bulk regulations, setbacks, sometimes parking requirements. And then to do kind of a comparative diagnosis of what we think is going on. So we're going to do that next. But first we're going to take a break just to do a little work together. And I'd like to invite any of you that have a comment or a concern to share about the direction this is going. I mean, I basically want you to tell me whether or not we basically understand the sort of underlying logic of what we laid out so far.
I'm sorry? Oh, I can shout that in, but I will. I'm Barry Royce. I chair the zoning board in the new municipality, and for many years I was also on the borough's zoning board. One of the things that you don't seem to have talked about, and it seems to me to be most important, is that Princeton existed in some form before zoning was plonked on top of it. And the plonkers, whoever they were, took very little cognizance of what lay underneath, and as a consequence of which, if I remember approximately, 60% of the lots in Princeton do not meet the requirements of the zone in which they are situated. So you're picking individual houses, and yes, I live on Harriet Drive, 3 or 4 lots have disappeared and different houses have come up there. But how are you dealing with this overall problem of 60% of the lots not meeting the zoning requirements? And is there some mysterious way in which you think making choices of discrete buildings will provide important insight into dealing with that?
No, you're talking about lot dimension. You're absolutely correct. I mean, that's exactly what we're documenting, where there is a disconnect between what the plunkers brought and what's the DNA of the place that's here. I mean, that's what this exercise has really meant to surface. Absolutely. So I agree with what you say, and I'll show you a picture of it. So press on. Oh, we already did that. Never mind. So here we are, Westcott, Library Place, Cleveland Lane, in the former borough. So these are our larger lot houses, and there's a certain kind of rhythm, but as you pointed out, there is a disconnect between the scale of lots and what's required, which leaves latent capacity, which provides opportunity for investment in larger houses, and sometimes that's welcome and sometimes it's out of character. So what we want to do now is make sure that we understand, what's really going on here. But it's also, when you look at this place now, it has matured to provide, a fine landscape, great streets, walkable, near town, and so you can understand sort of why it's attractive, and it means that. And the one thing we're going to do through this exercise is kind of document, what's really here, what's precious about that, and what needs to be folded back into zoning. Also, it is similar to some of the zoning districts in the township, and that there is an opportunity to sort of fold those together. Although the township, for same size lots, same frontage, has a totally different set of setbacks, especially rear yard setback, which is something we'll want to talk to. Again, in the borough R2, so now we're at smaller lots, half-quarter acre lots. And this gets to the kind of thing I was talking about before, where the buildings start to frame the street a little more closely, and unlike the larger lots, it's a lot more important how the building addresses and connects to the street. This is actually Fisher Ave, which I showed you earlier. And that's a place that's populated by a lot of 1950s houses that are going to, normal succession, that there are going to be changes there. And one of the things that the zoning can do is to anticipate the kind of buildings that want to be there, and then think through how best to make it a good brother, sister to the rest of houses on block. So this is Little, Witherspoon John Street neighborhood, 8-acre lots. There, the sort of how each building relates to its sort of individual neighbor, how that sort of size up, and also the rhythm of building, garden, driveway, porch is really important. Front entrance is really important. And I think one of the things that's been missing from the zoning ordinances are just how to protect the nature of the street. Also, I think is the place to revisit the parking ratio. Here, there's 1 per unit, or 1.5 per unit if it's multifamily. So there's something a little bit destructive about the parking requirements, but also there's a kind of equity issue too. Why does this person have to not have parking if I do? So there's a thing that's going on where provision of parking according to zoning in this district should be reevaluated as part of this exercise. I have a comment.
Sorry to interrupt. So Joshua Zinder, I live on Moore Street, and Joshua Zinder, I live on Moore Street. Following up on Mr. Royce's comment before, you're talking about eighth acre lot, quarter acre lot. That's what the zoning prescribes. It doesn't mean that that's necessarily what's prevailing in that neighborhood.
Correct.
So I mean, you talk about Witherspoon Jackson. Most of those lots are, what Mr. Royce was talking about before, non-conforming. I mean, somebody brings up those lots now, the lot's supposed to comply with an 8th acre and have certain setbacks, but because they're nowhere near that size, it basically throws all the rest of the zoning out the door. So when you're going through this, it's really the question of, I think a lot of people understand what the current zoning is. It's how do you deal with, rescaling it to those particular neighborhoods.
That's a great point, because that brings up another kind of anomaly that's baked into the code, which is the small lot bonus. So where in a way, the sort of DNA nature of the place is thrown out the window in favor of meeting a somewhat arbitrary FAR, which is something we need to get into. I think that in some ways there's latent value baked into that, but I think through this exercise we'll define public good and way forward. So, thank you for that. And in fact, even on Little Street, it says a 8th acre lot, but most of them are about 2/3 that size. Lytle. Thank you. You let me say it over and over again. Moving over to the township, three-quarter acre lots. These are largely, I think, conforming, but also they have, and in fact are larger than required. So that provides a certain opportunity to build out. Just looking at what I wrote here. Getting closer to the river. This is Riverside and Knoll. I said that right. Thinking about, doing the X-ray of the zoning code, here in the township, there's no height restriction. It's guided by kind of another set of metrics and informed by a kind of a height to setback ratio. And one of the things that happens here, because the properties are so deep, and they're not required to be deep, they just happen to be deep, there's an opportunity to build very high-ceilinged homes. And that's partially also driven by the sort of peculiarly tiny rear yard setback requirement, 15 feet, which is one way that the old borough zoning, which is still in effect, is different than the township zoning for very similarly situated parcels. Here, though, like I said before, the small lots have a different set of topics that we'll want to think about together. And here, there's a lot of site planning issues. You might think about if the hood is up, you might reintroduce better, best practices regarding stormwater management, pervious surface, things like that. That's the kinds of things that other communities are concluding when they do this. All right, Terhune and Walnut Lane. Here there's something curious about the evolution. Looking at Walnut Lane, that's crossed by Valley Road, but then the other streets change names as they cross. What is one side split levels and the other side ranches or something like that. It was just another moment in the evolution. But they're same zoning district. So revisit that principle that I laid out. Agree, disagree. Although character, scale, and era do vary, individual Princeton neighborhood streets and houses exemplify building traditions that should be respected and landscape conventions that should be disregarded only rarely. Does that make sense? I mean, as a place to start the discussion. So I want to carry this a little bit deeper before we break for discussion again. I think it's important that we sort of look at the underlying economics a little bit. So 4 transaction types. Developer buys an older house, smaller house usually, tears it down and builds and sells it. That's a high percentage of the activity that's happening here. New homeowner. I buy the old house, I tear it down, and I rebuild it. Sometimes the developer hasn't, the developer just hasn't brought the house to market yet for some reason, but we understand what's going on with the permits, so that's what we're telling you here. Or Keener families lived here for 27 years, we're affluent now, we want to build a great house, the house we always deserved. So we tear down our house and build a new one right there on the site where we've lived all these years. That's a smaller percentage than you might think. So does that make sense? That's where you aligns with what you think is going on.
Are you considering a scenario where they don't demolish the property and rebuild it entirely? I mean, there's a lot where people are perhaps doing additions that are historically consistent. Everyone on their street has, for instance, dormers in the front, and now they want to refinish that.
Yeah. Well, these are just demolitions of, we did gauge, we have measured large additions, but we haven't gone back and test for quality like you just talked about. This is real arithmetic.
Yeah, this is actual
And
data.
we'll post the sort of data. Well, no, not that you're questioning my integrity or accuracy, but is it like what you thought it was? That's what I meant. Yeah, that's data.
I just follow up on that. I asked the question, but I'd really like to... Oh, sure.
Jim Peterson, Van Deventer Avenue. So
Start at the microphone, then
Is it on?
that wasn't loud
There
enough.
we go.
Okay. Jim Peterson, Van Deventer Avenue. I mean, if tear-downs and rebuilds and not historically consistent rebuilds are not what we want, I just think that maybe part of your planning and review should be thinking of ways that, particularly in these areas, the plunk districts where the zoning is sitting and we have crazy setbacks that make it impossible to do anything with your property absent, getting a variance. If there's some way to look at that more generally so that you can encourage historically appropriate, let's say, additions to homes, because they're going to happen as long as, you guys are architects, but I suspect that the desire to modify your dwelling has gone back to the cavemen, okay? And the nature of a lot of what we consider to be historically consistent styles, like the New England salt box, they're additions. And things, the way people make an addition to like a single bay colonial by stepping down and making a smaller one, that's something that we think of as inherently right and correct. Well, it happened in response to people wanting to modify their dwellings and to fit their new circumstances and new times. And so I guess what I'm getting at is I hope you will do things that make it easier for people to make appropriate revisions to their houses, short of tearing them down and building them in a new fashion wholesale. Thank you.
Terrific point. I don't know this totally supports your point, but Alexandria, they came to the same conclusion, and what they acknowledged that there would be ambitions to, change dramatically, houses from time to time by the current owner. And what they did was they provided an advisory panel to sort of assist with that. And in a way, you would trade the pain of going through a variance to participating at this kind of lighter level of advice.
I'd just like to add, Mark is bringing up Alexandria, Virginia as an example, and if on the website, for those who haven't seen the research page, there'll be links to a lot of different examples from Somerville, a lot of the towns that Mark mentioned. There's links to articles and policy documents on the website on the research page. And we bring up Alexandria because they did a very, very thorough process with a lot of documentation of their presentations, and you could that's the one example which you can really follow how they made decisions. And whereas the other ones were good examples as well, but there's less substance in terms of things to show.
Going back to the question about is it data or is it speculation, Neil actually mapped that. So you can start to see the locations of those 4 transaction types, which will be posted and available for perusement. 2005 to 2016, so I count 11. Digging down into what is happening here in terms of dollars and cents, you're not getting a lot of extra bedrooms. A 3 or 4 bedroom house becomes a 4 or 5 bedroom house. There is a delta in the cost versus sales price, or sales versus sales price. The older house I buy, if I'm a developer, for $550,000, say, and the new house, after I finish the new build-out, sell for $1.3 million to $1.5 million.
And this is the typical kind of situation from looking at all the different examples.
So Gauging impacts in terms of schools, taxes, affordability, those are the metrics that we were thinking about. So those larger houses generate a third of a kid per house, which is, not profound or not that challenging in terms of the overall dimension, impact on school district. I think, if we go back and test that, you'll find that that's correct. There is a delta in the taxes paid by a new owner versus the departing owner, $27,000 per house. You do the math, over 10 years, that's north of $5 million difference in taxes paid by residential development. Of course, there is another sort of other side of that, affordability. If I make my family pulls in $115,000 a year, I can buy the house, if I'm inclined to buy the house, the $500,000 house. But the newer house requires a much greater household income, of course. So the new house, the sort of threshold is $285,000 a year, which I think, Lee, when you and I talked about that, that seems like more of a reach than you might want to take on at that income level, but people do it. Does that all make sense? Anyone want to bring up something that you want your consultants to be thinking about? I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental topics. Yes, come up.
Hi, Kalina Peterson. I guess I have a question or more of a comment. We all know that architecture and houses reflect our fashions and knowledge at the time, and as we progress through time, housing changes. So there is a lot of talk about the DNA of neighborhoods and how do we preserve that. And although we all have respect for the nature of neighborhoods, how do we allow for progress and for change, especially in the types of neighborhoods like the Borough where the lots are small and so on and so forth. And if we don't allow for change, then we seem to be locked forcefully into perhaps buildings and homes. Not only they just don't reflect today's lifestyle, and they were not necessarily even good at the time when they were built.
I'm so glad you said that, because that is really the complex
So how do you
conundrum.
deal with that?
Yep. I mean, sometimes, almost every time, in some ways, this is just the normal succession of things, right? So it's how to sort of get at both. I think that if we look at the zoning code now, you wouldn't say it's perfect. And so once you start to investigate into what things are not perfect and should be changed, you'll sort of follow that up to the moment where it stops making sense, right? The things that you're doing to improve it or not improving it are not in defending public purpose.
I grew up in a house on Hawthorne Avenue on the corner, and we have a little garage in the back. And I don't know if this is necessarily relevant, but this is about setbacks. That I remember my father really being upset in the 50s because we originally had a little tiny, tiny garage that was in the very back of the property, so pretty much on the property line. And he wanted to build a two-car garage to replace that, and he couldn't do it. And I remember him fuming about that, and so he built a one-car garage. Now, my husband and I have 3 vehicles, and we have a tiny little one-car garage that's sitting on the exact place where the old one was, because that was the only way my father could do it. And I don't think we could do anything else either. And I, at one point, even tried to investigate the idea of having a sort of a small storage building, and it seemed that the setback from, we're on the corner, so Chestnut Street, it would have to be over practically to the neighbor's, lot to be that setback, to accommodate that setback. And of course, it had to be a certain distance from the neighbor, so, the only way we could do it is something about a foot wide in the middle of the yard. So, in other words, there should be a possibility to do something a little better than that. But, for what it's worth, I don't know.
Your initial point was to sort of ask, is that sort of topic issue part of this discussion? I think absolutely it is.
I'm not sure if
Yes.
it's totally
Yes, it
relevant,
is.
but it
Yes.
certainly seemed to be a problem with
Thank
my
you.
family.
I think it's interesting to look at affordability and income, but I guess one thing or a few things you won't know or able to find out is how many people come to the table with money, whether they previously owned a house and just sold it, or they inherited money and it's multi-generational money. And that's something I think that happens in Princeton a lot, which affects affordability versus income, and it's just something you'll never know.
Well, that's very hard data to track, but I agree.
Hi, Judith Wooldridge from Harris Road. I missed the beginning, so I don't know whether you covered this, but I'm not sure if zoning covers the height of a building. Clearly, the new houses in my neighborhood are all much taller than the others. Not only that, they go far deeper into the ground, which I guess is an environmental consideration more than anything, because it may affect water distribution in the street. But I'd just like you to think about height of houses relative to the other houses as a factor in neighborhood change.
Yes, absolutely. That is a topic of discussion as part of this exercise. Thank you.
Achilles Antonio Harris Road. Is there any different approach to tear downs versus drastic renovation? Is there something that can be done to encourage perhaps renovation, right, on the old footprint or whatever is allowed in terms of expansion rather than tearing down and changing completely the nature of the building?
Well, there's three different answers to that. But the one that I'm focusing on is a discussion about design guidelines. I think that when you imagine these kind of extensive expansions, are you thinking that those are done by homeowner?
Yes,
Yeah.
and others.
Yeah, so for instance, one of the examples I pointed out was a sort of a pattern book, which is really meant to provide advice on, how to do that kind of expansion. We talked a little bit about how to encourage it, but also how to guide it, especially those times when expansion is in one of these non-conforming lots. You could be, the municipality in that case provided really terrific expert guidance on how to do that in a way that protects community against bad advice or bad architects.
Where is that advice available?
There's various communities that have produced this, and one of the things that we might decide is important to do in Princeton is just that.
Okay, thanks.
I thought we have plenty of time. I just wanted to make sure that we did sort of look closely at MLUL, Land Use Law in New Jersey, which provides even more liberty than some states on providing guidance on appearance and design topics. Although it's not so liberal that says you can sort of dictate or legislate design or taste, but as long as it's reasonably supported by public purpose in New Jersey, municipalities do have some liberty. It doesn't mean they have to do it. It just means that it's been defended by case law. Also, dimensional topics and bulk provisions are not dictated by MLUL, but by municipality, and that's been defended as well. This little statement about aesthetics that'll be online. You want to know, not just what you should do or want to do, but how far you could go and when you're stepping over the line. Again, this goes back to the sort of underlying trend that does have environmental considerations. You have building footprint on the site is larger, more impervious surface. That comes along with taking down of all the tree canopy, providing a much larger lawn or paved areas. That has implications for stormwater management and flooding and soil erosion. And I think that we're starting to update zoning codes so that you incorporate that kind of guidance for a builder-developer homeowner. Environmental impacts. We want to make sure we understand what they are and add to this list if we should. Tree canopy, soil stability, stormwater, just talked about that. There are other kinds of landscape issues that can be defended and described by best practice standards. Light trespass, bigger buildings closer to the sideline, sometimes that's an issue. Energy consumption, some municipalities embed expectations for, LEED or excellence that can be measured and documented in either energy consumption or efficiency. So what's next? As we move ahead, we'll be inviting a further discussion on more sort of technical level, and after a bit, you'll see planners report from us that'll have advice on near-term actions that Princeton can take. Here's a kind of a short list based on what I've been saying today. Landscape guidance, stormwater ordinance, those car-first houses in certain locations, I think, could be challenged by the zoning code. Repetition provision, or some people call it anti-clone ordinance. There are places where you have to if you have an identical house next to an identical house to the next identical house, it's just peculiar, right? There's other places like a cottage street where, like the old Sears houses in a row, that's perfect. And you enjoy the evolution of those things over time. So we'll bring that to the table as a point of discussion. Driveway width or yard paving sometimes is a problem. Sometimes that's because parking provisions need to be recalibrated to, or even parking regulation needs to be recalibrated according to the street of the neighborhood. I have a customer.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate the direction of your discussion. It sounds really helpful. We had written down some ideas before we came, but I do have two other questions. One is, I understood that you would not be just working in your office and working independently in the neighborhoods, but that you would be talking to people in the neighborhoods. Is that still planned?
Yeah,
And how will you do that?
We'll talk about that in a second, but I'll tell you now because you asked. There's 3 upcoming work sessions, which haven't been defined, designed, or announced yet, but the answer to your question is yes.
And how will you determine who attends that?
Well, you'll be self-selecting in a way, but each one of these work sessions will be kind of themed.
Sort of sign up, is that it?
There'll be a sign-up, there'll be announcements.
Okay, that's great. And then the other question is, will this presentation be online?
Yes.
Completely, okay,
As soon as I get my ridiculous sidebar notes out, but yeah,
Perfect.
I'll be posted.
So my name is Mary Clerman, and I live on Harris Road, and we're very happy that you're here and that the town is doing this with you. The town is changing. Our purpose is not to prohibit change, excuse me, but to avoid chaotic change. We suggest consideration of the following points. I don't know what's happening here. Any application for a permit to demolish a private house should be accompanied by a detailed plan of the structure that's proposed to replace it. We're talking about legislation here, ordinances. If a variance is requested, the default response of the relevant municipal board should be to reject it, with attention only to special cases and to hardship, and that standards should be applied and followed. They should include the following. Setbacks should be consistent with the existing setbacks of a single neighborhood or block, which I think you're dealing with. Only natural barriers, such as hedges, should be allowed in front of new houses. And of course, again, garage doors facing the street should be restricted to occupying only a certain percentage of the facade. We think attention to these features will go far toward keeping the town livable, and look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else on the sort of trajectory we're on here?
My name is Dozier Hammond, Lee Avenue. I just want to say so far I'm very impressed with what you've done. I like the fact that you talked about the economic impact of what's going on, both for the people who are there, but also for the residents who are now here. And what we're seeing is, according to the transformation that you're talking about, basically a doubling of the average income of our town. And while it's fine to have more rich people move into town, Princeton probably has a higher percentage than most towns in the state, I think we also want to, and I think a lot of what you're pointing out here is important, also be able to keep a working class here that has been here for a long time and leads to a diversity both racially and economically in the town. So I'm glad you're pointing out a lot of those factors. Thank you.
Thank you. If I were you, and a question that sort of tags, the question I would have that sort of tags onto something one of you said is, so how do we follow, influence, comment on, where this is going? So there's the website, and you'll be able to see our work, and plus work of a whole lot of other people that have been down this path in a sense. So you can spend time with that to sort of see what the sort of thought basis for where this is going is coming from.
I also agree this is a wonderful report, and you've done a lot of work for it. But ultimately, we all have our voices heard here, but we don't make the decisions. The zoning board does, right? So how do we influence them to take into consideration all the recommendations or possibilities?
Yeah.
Where do you actually have influence?
It's a representative democracy, not an true egalitarian democracy. We're not.
Zoning board,
Yeah.
right? How do you influence the zoning board that's not elected?
Right.
Well, who changes the codes?
Yeah, actually, yeah. It's yeah, you're electeds. Governing body makes these decisions. If I was a zoning officer here, I'm obliged to enforce them, even if they are, yeah. So, governing body. So that's the exercise. We're talking about public policy, and that's council and the mayor. Right. So there will be 3 work sessions that have the opportunity to attend, at least one. So I wish I could be more definitive about where they are, but a lot of effort comes to get in this room here. That's what's coming next. We're going to define the sort of rollout and public discussion. And then there'll be a draft of the report that also provides opportunity for discussion.
And I think to answer your question, also to further add to the response, I mean, if some of these things will involve ordinance changes, which means they could become law. So that's how it's, and that is council.
And the hearings that consider those as another opportunity.
Right, and there's the public hearings that are involved in that process of the adoption of those ordinances.
In that ordinancing process, the municipality is subject to the state land use law. And could you address the fact that under the state land use law, single-family homes are not subject to site plan review? So there are limitations to begin with in that process.
Right, and that was similar to the kind of crossroads that Alexandria came to, where they provided a kind of optional but binding process that wasn't site plan review. Now, I'd ask you, if I come to a variance and they say, the municipality says, well, we're not inclined to approve your variance, but we are offering you this other opportunity, and I wish you would take it, which is to go meet with a committee that provides advisory, capacity and can, provide certain conditions. So it's another layer, but it's also municipal participation in the decision-making process. You're saying that wouldn't fly in New Jersey?
Well, under a variance scenario, it might,
Yeah.
but as an as-of-right scenario, it would not.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is an issue to make sure that there would be conformance with things like the site design issues we started to talk about. All you've got is what? The building occupancy. You can you can come and say, at the inspection, is there a threshold where I can find out that you're, because I'm not looking at your site plan, right? That's what you're saying. So where do I find out that you've paved too much of your lot? And, yeah. But I mean, what's the municipality's mechanism for saying, no, this doesn't fly, if I'm not looking at your site plan? It's only after the fact, essentially. Yeah. Thank you.
Excuse me, Mark, could you go back to slide 53? And I think you never finished going through the list of the strategies that we may be looking at, and we'd really like to get input from the public at large in terms of, the comment was, well, the zoning board always grants something. Well, we need to change the zoning so the zoning board has the tools to do it. We're looking at that, and what is up on the slide, I think, is really a two-part process. One, sort of the near-term activities that we're thinking about starting, and we need to hear from others as to if there are some others, and we're going to investigate that further in these smaller focus group meetings that Mark was talking about. And then there are some longer-term things like updating the land use element, providing design guides, and as Alan was saying, they're only advisory. We can't necessarily require some of the design guidelines, and there's some question legally whether or not we can, but clearly if it's put in a way that's easily measurable, we might be able to, and we're going to look at that, and that there are other regulatory approaches to address the bulk controls, some sort of oversight process, and economic. So there's a series, but what we were hoping is we would get more input, at least I was, on this slide to know, are we headed in the right direction? Are there things, I think Mary Clerman mentioned something about height, which we don't have specifically up there. Oh, we do. We have height matching prevailing character. So that if there are other topics that you would like to see, at least that could either be a near term or in a future, we'd love to hear from you. We will be doing, as Mark said, some follow-up sessions, some focus groups, meeting with some neighbors, meeting with some local professionals. A lot of architects are in the room already, and trying to build from that in terms of what design guidelines we can have, what changes we need to make. It was a little hard to read on the big screen when we were looking at the individual zones and how they compare. If we find a neighborhood where the zoning doesn't match what's in the ground, what Mark was really saying is, well, maybe you need to change that, and we will be looking at that. Mark will be identifying some of those neighborhoods. So if you're aware of specific neighborhoods where the zoning doesn't match what's on the ground, love to hear that as well, I think.
And the website offers anyone the opportunity to comment.
Correct, and that's PrincetonNeighborhoods.org.
The email, which is, it's contact@princetonneighborhoods.org. It's written on the opening page of the website. Look for the questions and comments box, and there will be the email address there. You can submit any questions or comments.
Joshua Zinder again. I'm curious, I know there are a lot of different issues that have to be addressed, but just one that certainly has come up often lately in some of the zoning meetings. You know, if you have a street, let's say, that has 50% of the houses that has been rescaled, so you have half of the houses on the street that are 1950s scale and half of them that are 2015 scale, and you're looking at prevailing character, how do you mediate between the two? And, you know, from a planning point of view, what's the advice you give to a community?
Exactly. I mean, it's like, was it Random Road? Did I say that right? I mean, there are places.
There are a number of them, actually.
That are already at that place, exactly right.
Right, so that's the question I'm putting out to you is,
at that point,
how do you mediate?
Yeah, at that point, the prevailing characteristics is not a sort of a happy tool. You have to really think, is this normal succession? And you want to make sure that, you know, the investment can keep going in that direction. So all these things, this is just a sort of toolbox.
The challenge you have is that I think many of the people who've lived on those streets for a very long time and are not the developers, you know, they're looking for, they liked the scale of the neighborhood before. Now that it's changed because half of the houses have changed, how do you balance between the two? Is there a balance between the two? Or are you stuck saying that because these people, the developers or whomever, has increased the scale of the neighborhood, now that has to be the acceptable zoning moving forward?
Yeah. Well, prevailing is a snapshot in time, like it's now. So one way that has been addressed is to say, the houses in the block, you measure the height of houses in the block, and you do it in this way, and you take average. So that starts to, or you say you narrow that to 2 houses either side, and that maybe helps provide transition.
I wish I had my thoughts more fully formed, but so I may be a little bit scattershot, but I live in the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood, relatively new resident, 16 months. I think in that neighborhood is a glaring example, and I'm sure there are many others in many other neighborhoods in town, where the zoning is not aligned with the neighborhood conditions and character. And I would hope that we are one of the neighborhoods that gets an opportunity to meet and talk about how zoning might be changed in order to be more consistent with what's there right now. And I think that might help to address some of what this gentleman raised.
Give me a couple off the top of the head. I mean, I know that lot size, setbacks are sort of one area. Then there's also probably other metrics that could be included in zoning for neighborhoods like that.
The setbacks and lot size are the sort of big issues. There's also a lot of variance, even from one side of a street to another, on the height. I don't know what the answer is. I think that list of near-term activities looks really good. And particularly, I think it's important to be looking at parking and have a personal/professional interest in stormwater management, so I'm glad to see that up there too. Living sort of close to all the new units that are built along 206 immediately west of my neighborhood, I'm interested in repetition provision. A thought given to that. Does that just general design guidelines?
So
and I think relative to what was raised about what determines prevailing character, I mean, I think one of the benefits of home rule and municipal land use law is that a community can determine what it is and what it wants to be. So I don't think that you have to be, if, as is the case on my street, Lytle Street, probably 6 or 7 of the houses out of, it's still not a majority of houses, but a lot of houses are tear down rebuilds. That doesn't mean that those new structures should forever define the character of Lytle Street. I would say absolutely not, particularly because of our new historic district designation.
That wasn't scattershot at all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to my neighbor beating me to the mic. I'm from the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood as well. I would like to confirm that you will be adding what Mr. Peterson suggested in terms of substantial additions to what you're considering on that list of 4 as your 5th category. With regard to building form, yes, the setbacks, the height, and the bulk, but the more detailed definitions of living area as it relates to the FAR becomes the definer of the utility of the structure. And while in the 50s, the basement was seen primarily as a storage space for a water heater and a furnace, that's no longer the way houses are lived in. And very few houses today are just built with storage attics as well. And that if we're looking more at the volume so that we can move into an era of a different type of use, a larger volume of livable area, but within the same above-ground box, I think we should look at that. So it goes beyond, in the zoning, if you have a livable basement and attic and a certain percentage of that, it figures into your FAR. Okay, so that it tends to be that you really only have a first and second floor living area, okay? People want bigger houses, they want more living area. You have the volume, you have the existing box, you have a basement and an attic. And you could live within that same and gain the same utility. Some of it perhaps using the dormers of the same way Cape Cods do, towards the rear, and of course this is a historic area. The other thing I'd like for you to look at, and I think you mentioned it a little bit, was technologies or utility heating systems, okay, is one, or sources of energy. The big push is photovoltaic systems that many suburban areas are taking advantage of, where it's sort of hard to adapt it into the more the older neighborhoods. And we need to find a way that that can also be phased in.
Support solar orientation and...
Well, also in terms of roof lines and where these things appear. They're probably, in our neighborhood that has historic designation, you'd rather not see them. That means only the houses with rear-facing southern
I have the same problem.
have that advantage. But if you have a front, so that there are some issues that come into play that help on the issue of affordability, that are part of how you gain your power and derive your ability to live within the structure.
Can I ask a question about the first point you made about the basement? When I was trying to form a mental picture where you were going with that, I was trying to figure out whether you support the notion of elevating the basement and therefore elevating the ground floor as a way of bringing natural light into what used to just be the utility area.
Well,
sometimes it creates a kind of peculiar outcome.
Basement windows and perhaps can have for exit if you have a bedroom. But, if it's family room space and it's not a sleeping area, you can basically do that down there.
Okay, terrific.
Okay, but I wouldn't try to push the house up higher to accommodate, dig deeper for higher ceilings.
Understood.
Thank you.
Hello, Evan Yaski, Hawthorne Avenue, and unfortunately I was delayed arriving to the meeting today, so my apologies in advance if my comments or questions are missed relate to topics or information that you presented earlier. So I'm wondering whether how much use has been part of the investigation you've been doing in the report, in that obviously what's been happening in recent years in Princeton is not unique. We're seeing that all over the country, particularly in the wealthier towns and sections of cities. But so the pressure to increase the density of use on a piece of property is a common development pattern, and so many people are concerned about the economics and the issues of affordability and diversity in our town. So one way to address that, since we're seeing many houses, as you've shown, that are 900,000 square foot larger than the house that they replaced, seems like that's enough to have an extra dwelling unit on the same property. So is part of the investigation and questions that are being raised here are, can we increase the number of dwelling units on a property as a way to address the issue of affordability?
Yeah, that's been broached in discussion. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's definitely, at issue here.
Great.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Scott Sillers. On your near-term activities, as part of your height match to prevailing character, I would urge that you include in there a floor level consistency, ground floor level consistency across the neighborhood. There's so many examples in the town of tear downs where, in order to save a few dollars, they don't sink a foundation. It saves them the expense of digging it and that potential hassle of flooding basements, and you wind up with houses that are sticking up like a sore thumb well above the surrounding neighborhood. And not only does it not look good, but it creates additional flood problems for the surrounding neighborhood. So I think that's an important addition to that.
You're right.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Marina Rubina. I'm a local architect, also live in Witherspoon, Jackson neighborhood. 3 points that I wanted to make. One is I've worked in other municipalities that differently govern new construction as opposed to remodels. And what that leads to, in my opinion, is sort of this game for putting up 3 old studs and putting mud on them. And what I hope that we in this town stay away from that and sort of think about what the final result is and what we want the final result to be, and how people get to that final result is up to them and up to the economic circumstances. Because I've worked on projects where remodeling something was $200,000 more expensive than taking it down and building a new thing. And do I want to put clients in a situation where we now have to make somebody pay $200,000 extra to do something? I'm not sure that's what we're here to do. So what I hope we could think about is what is the final result and how do we make sure that the final result is appropriate rather than what is the method of getting to that.
So your advice is that if you elevate the level of regulatory friction around new construction, that doesn't
everybody's going to leave things outstanding. Yes,
Yeah.
I've been to those municipalities, and I must say that I had a very interesting interaction with our tax assessor where, again, in those other municipalities where I've done work, it's taxed differently, whether it's new construction or whether it's remodel, and there are different incentives and people want to make it a remodel. And our tax assessor came and he said, you know, I don't care how you got there. I look at what it is today and how it's comparable to other things, and that's what we tax on. So that's sort of thinking of what is the final result we're trying to achieve. That was my one point. Another point, I'm very much in agreement with Evan about thinking about density. And we have zoning situations right now where there's an old house on a really large lot, and the only option is to build a ginormous house. And when somebody comes, and we've recently tried this, and all the lawyers in town would say, oh, there's no way they will let you build a duplex. There's no way. That is just appalling, because we all love those more Jefferson duplexes, and wouldn't we want to have more of those? So somehow addressing density and introducing some sort of bonus, because that's how we're going to get affordability. That maybe the size of the envelope will be the same, but at least there'll be 2 families living there. In my opinion, there's something to consider. And my last point, sort of last but not least, is if we can think about what we're doing right now, we're sort of in the whack-a-mole situation where we're like, stop, 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 right? Can we think about how do we think forward? How can we use these meetings that you're going to be having to think about how we're going to be living in the future? How we don't want to be doing this 20 years from now again. Can we think 10 years, 20 years ahead? Where do we want more density? How are we going to be using public transportation? Where is this going? Rather than trying to sort of stop, 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 think forward. Can we dream? Can we imagine? And sort of set our zoning for that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's sort of what I meant in the introduction when I said, you know, this is not a discussion about the untimely demise of 200 middle-aged houses. There really are sort of big pictures here, and this is an opportunity to open that door and think that way.
I meant to mention before, and totally forgot, but a lot of what she said brought it right back, and that is the Witherspoon Street corridor and the need to think really carefully about what is the final result? You know, how that is going to look and function, what it's going to be in 5 years or 10 years. The Avalon units are filling up the neighborhood. That corridor, I believe, is going to change rapidly. And I just think it's very important to be thinking proactively about exactly how the community wants that to happen.
Thank you.
Paul Driscoll, Harris Road. And I wanted to expand on what somebody said earlier, and it may be covered in your stormwater ordinance tune-up, but he mentioned that the basements are not sunk in as they should be. And I've noticed that around town there's a lot of serious upgrading. And do you plan to address that, grading up on the property when a new house is put in? Because
building a little hill to put the house on?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's really obvious in some neighborhoods. And what will happen is a ranch house will be torn down. It'll have a one-car garage. They'll put an elevated basement, but they'll grade up the land around it. They'll have sometimes a two-car or a three-car garage, and then they'll have I know you've been addressing this throughout but I wanted to emphasize that it's very important. A paved driveway, sometimes replacing a gravel driveway. So now you have a lot of non-porous surface area, which is maybe 3 times what the original house was. And I don't know how the neighbors put up with it, because they're sitting right next door. They now have a big house with a big upgraded piece of property that's sloping down on their house. And if they have a basement, it puts their foundation at risk. And I don't think any homeowner that's already living in the neighborhood should be put at that risk. And for myself, I know what it costs. I had a cracked foundation that had to be replaced. It's very expensive. It involves regrading. And I don't know how the developers have ever been allowed to do this in the first place. My brothers are in the landscaping business. They live in Maryland. They say there are laws against grading up in Maryland. And there are also laws against too large a surface area being paved. And I think it all goes back to this size, scale, and relativity. It's great to say that people need bigger homes now for more modern lifestyles, but it may not be practical. The way they're doing it is not practical in the small lot neighborhoods where people are really impacted by what kind of house is built right next to them. Maybe out in the township, it would be a little bit different. So when I saw the stormwater ordinance tune-up, I'd like to expand on that and have it, because it really does impact people's budgets and what it costs to repair their homes.
Exactly. Thank you very much. I mean, that is exactly where we anticipate going and bringing the model ordinances that address that sort of thing for consideration for adoption. Yes.
I think one more concern that has been bothering everybody that I've spoken to is the cost and the cost benefit of expansion of housing in Princeton. I know that's not directly your concern. You're talking about neighborhoods, but we're talking about the whole town here. My understanding is that there are 40 new children in the community park school, thanks to Merrill Stanworth development for graduate students and their families. So it would be very helpful if the town could provide a cost-benefit analysis, something of the costs and the effect on taxes, the effect on schools, and the effect on traffic of the expansion that's going on.
Sort of that. Well, this has been terrific. I want to make sure that you all have the sort of website to understand, what's there, one, and also so that we can update for our next work session together. Yes, sir. You signed up?
Yep.
Do that.
There's a couple of ways. Can you get the web on this?
Oh, sure. I think so, yeah.
Website.
Okay.
No, there's free Wi-Fi.
Mark, could I just interrupt? If, there's a little square table in the back, if you sign up, put your email address, we'll also send out an email blast to everybody about the next meeting or upcoming meetings. And as Neil and Mark said, if you sign up on the web page, every time that gets updated, you'll get a notice. But please use the sign-in sheet. We're just asking for name and email so that we can keep everybody in the loop as we further develop the program.
Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. Yeah.